If everyone takes their seats, welcome to day 2 of the Global Grid Forum. My name is Daniel Knoll at the Edison Electric Institute. Thank you all for being here for our day 2 keynote and our last few sessions. Just a couple housekeeping notes while we get started. Thank you to our sponsors, Navigant and Smart Wires, for making this event possible. Like we did yesterday, we will be using the Slido tool for asking questions, both questions that you want to submit for our keynote presentation and the panels afterwards. So if you weren't here yesterday or if you need a reminder, you can go to sli.do, enter in the event code, submit your questions there. We'll be moderating them and then providing them to the moderators. So to take things forward, I'll turn it over to Lawrence Jones.
Thank you, Daniel. Actually, I'll stand. I'm already standing. So. Good morning. And like Daniel said, this day 2 is going to be kicked off with a keynote address by Robb from NERC. And so one of the things I want to say to sort of set the scene here is, obviously, we all understand the importance of reliability. We understand the importance of security. We understand the importance of standards and all the things that are necessary to keep the lights on. And so, well, we're very honored that Jim, a very busy man, as you would imagine, can come and share his thoughts with us. So what we're going to do is he's going to give his keynote address for about, say, I guess 20 minutes or so, or how much time you want is up to you. And then we'll get into the Q&A. And again, like Daniel said, you can start sending me questions once he starts, and then we'll have a dialogue like we did yesterday. So please welcome Robb.
Thanks, Larry. Lawrence. I did, didn't I? Sorry, Lawrence. No, Lawrence, thank you, and Francis and the other sponsoring organizations. I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk about something that I have quite a bit of passion around. I do have to admit, though, I was a little bit sobered when I came in yesterday and I saw the configuration of the room, because I thought I was going to have to be down in the center giving the speech in the round, and I wasn't sure how that was going to work. So I feel much more safe here. International collaboration is a very, very important part of NERC, and it's also a very important part of my own personal history. If any of you looked at my bio, you would have noted that a long time ago I was a partner at McKinsey & Company, and I'll apologize to David and Francis because they've heard this joke before, but it's true. When I was at McKinsey in San Francisco, we decided that we needed to have a location and a presence in the Pacific Northwest. And we debated a lot whether that should be Seattle or Vancouver. The firm now has both, but we decided to open in Seattle first. And we had 3 American partners, but the associates were half from Canada and half from the US. And the Canadian associates felt a little homeless, I guess. So they got together and they elected me the most Canadian of the three American partners. So I feel like I'm an international player myself. Anyway, I want to talk a little bit about the North American grid and reliability and security of the grid and how we approach it in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. So. I talk about the North American grid, and it's really important to talk about it as a North American grid because it's a highly interconnected system. Even though we're divided into 4 interconnections, there's a tremendous amount of energy exchange and critical services provided to and from each country in North America. It's a very complicated machine. It's a very large machine. It involves 3 countries. 4 interconnections, as I said. We have 15 reliability coordinators. A reliability coordinator is the operating entity that's charged with real-time coordination of flows and systems that are the highest level of authority, if you will, in terms of operating the system to make sure everything is balanced and operating reliably. We have 73 balancing authorities that are charged with ensuring that we have adequate reserves to meet loads, 184 transmission operators, almost 300 distribution companies, and nearly 1,000 generation owners in North America. So it's a very large, complex machine with a lot of players involved. And that machine serves the critical needs of society. We all know that electricity is fundamental to a modern way of life. That machine serves nearly 400 million customers across North America, 4.3 billion megawatts of energy consumed, over 1 million megawatts of capacity in order to serve peak needs. Nearly 6,000 central station generating units over 20 megawatts, and over 470,000 miles of transmission line. So a very large, very complicated machine. And what is truly amazing to me is that it operates with extraordinary reliability. 99.92% load served with no operator-controlled load shedding. And over the last, this has been true over the last 5 or 6 years, we categorize events in terms of cause and severity, and we've never had we've not had a category 3, 4, or 5 event since 2012. So the operating performance of the system is really quite extraordinary given its size, complexity, and particularly given the number of players that need to come together to make the system work. Electric reliability, as I'm sure you all know, is a very complicated prospect. You know, it wasn't such a big deal in the early days of the electric system, what I call here Grid 1.0, which is what we had in North America up until really kind of the World War II era, where we largely had isolated systems that were put in place to serve large urban loads, and utilities were largely self-contained. You know, starting in the 40s and over the ensuing decades, a major initiative was underway to integrate all those systems and created what we call now the bulk power system or the bulk electric system, which serves all the utilities, and it's all the utilities in North America together. This era, I call this Grid 2.0, and I don't know if that's a term of art that somebody else has coined. If not, I'm declaring the trademark for that now. You know, that era is characterized by large central station generation, largely oil, coal, and nuclear. Investment in very long transmission lines to interconnect systems, resource sharing across systems which lowered costs for customers, large economies of scale in building large generating plants. Of course, we had to instantaneously balance load and resource, and that required tremendous operating coordination and visibility and situational awareness of the utilities. And that was really important because, as you all know, when something happens on the electric system, it has a tendency to cascade very, very quickly. Things on the electric system happen at the speed of light. So the visibility and situational awareness, the planning, the operating of the system became much more complex. We're now starting another transition, and this is what I call the transition to Grid 3.0. The timing of this is, of course, highly uncertain, but it's going to be characterized by kind of continued expansion of natural gas generation, distributed generation behind the meter and on the distribution system, and generation that has less fuel assurance than what we've had in the past. So what we call variable generation, particularly wind and solar, right, are the largest sources of new generation being built in North America. We're also seeing a significant retirement of the old conventional generation. Coal and nuclear plants are in kind of chronic decline at this point. We've also seen over the last 10 years, and will continue to see going forward, expansion of digitization of the electric grid. So expansion of digital controls out on the system and behind the meter devices. So the Internet of Things, or as I like to call it, the Internet of Threats, because of the internet connectivity of all these devices and the attack vector that creates for adversaries and mischief makers. We're also likely to see over the course of the next decades substantial advancement in battery technology and deployment of batteries. We've seen what many people are proud of, battery deployments in places like Southern California and other parts of North America, but nothing near the level of deployment that we would need to see in order to see the rapid decarbonization of the system, as many would like to see us accomplish. But that's going to happen, in the coming years with technology investment and support. And then a strong push in North America for electrification, for space heating, for transportation needs, and for industrial processes. So we're seeing a very transformative set of actions being taken, both in terms of the load that the utilities are going to need to be able to serve, as well as the nature of the resources that will be required to serve it. And one of the challenges I think we have in this transition is just understanding that we tend to take the models that we've used and all the things that we grew up with and are trying to apply it to a completely different system. And right now we have a system where we don't really know what the load is because a lot of it's masked by behind-the-meter generation. We don't really know what the generation fleet is going to be able to do because we don't know if it's going to be sunny, if it's going to be windy, or if there could be gas supply issues. So the whole operating challenge of the system is becoming much, much more complex, which also has a lot of derivative implications for reliability. And the expansion of digitization, as I said, creates a real security set of challenges for the industry to deal with. The other thing that's important to note is that electricity doesn't respect international borders. NERC actually got its start coming out of the 1965 blackout of New York City, which originated when a relay south of Toronto in Canada misoperated, and that blackout cascaded and knocked out Manhattan. In 2003, the U.S. decided to return the favor, and a tree contacted a transmission line in Ohio, and again managed to knock out New York City, but also Toronto and much of Ontario. And that's what really gave rise to the North America taking a very serious approach to reliability and the notion of putting in place what we call the Electric Reliability Organization, or NERC. So let me just give you a quick snapshot of our history. So 1965, as I said, was the Northeast blackout. In response to that, industry started to form regional reliability councils. They were formed to coordinate planning and to put in place a series of voluntary standards for how the system would be operated. In 1968, 3 years later, NERC was formed as a partnership among all those regional councils to serve as a clearinghouse and a way to disseminate best practices among them. 2003, as I said, was the major blackout in New York and Ontario that gave rise to the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which is where the notion of creating an Electric Reliability Organization, or an ERO, was put in place. At that time, the U.S. and Canada signed a series of bilateral principles in terms of how the U.S. approach to reliability could be implemented and embraced in Canada while respecting the sovereign differences between the two countries. In 2006, NERC was certified by FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulator, which oversees us, but is a separate government organization. We were certified in 2006 to play the role of the ERO. We entered into a series of MOUs with the Canadian provinces that were interconnected that spelled out exactly how our work would mesh with things going on in each province around reliability, and importantly to respect the sovereignty of those provinces. We also have a memorandum of understanding with Mexico. The northern tip of Baja California is highly integrated in with Southern California, provides a lot of critical services to the San Diego area, and has always been part of the ERO. And we have an MOU with Mexico exploring the possibilities of integrating the other systems in Mexico into our regime as well. 2007 is when our first operating and planning standards were put in place, became enforceable. And in 2008, we put in place the first critical infrastructure protection standards, or what we call the SIP standards, to deal with cyber and physical security of the system. So that's a little walk through our history. Our mission is very clear, and it's one that I have a lot of passion around. It's to effectively and efficiently reduce risk to the reliability and security of the North American grid. We have, over the last several years, really embraced the notion of risk reduction and managing risk as our core raison d'etre, if you will. You can't talk about reliability without talking about security. So those are two very key components to the work that we do. This is a snapshot of how we do it. Again, we have an interconnected system with Canada and the northern part of Baja California. We have governing documents in place with Mexico. Although we're a U.S. corporation, we have government principles in place with Canada and Mexico. And we execute a lot of our programs through what we call six regional entities who do a lot of the field work under a delegation agreement that we have in place with them. When I started with the ERO 7 years ago, we had 8 regional entities. We're now down to 6, as 2 of them or 4 of them have merged together. So it's a very interesting structure. It's a different structure, but it's one that works quite well for the mission that we have to execute. We're a pretty unique organization. We are a private, nonprofit, self-regulatory organization. We operate under statute and statutory authority in the United States. Again, we're governed by a series of MOUs in Canada and Mexico. And we have delegated enforcement authority. So it's unusual for a private organization like ours to have the ability to actually issue fines for violations of standards. Now those fines all go to the Federal Energy Regulator for approval for U.S. entities, and enforcement in Canada and Mexico are handled by the local jurisdictions. So we provide oversight and will conduct audits, if you will, of entities in Mexico and Canada, but enforcement of noncompliances is a provincial responsibility. We're also interesting because we're an independent organization. We're funded through assessments, which are based on load, not by dues. So we're not a voluntary organization. Every customer in North America pays me 17 cents a year, maybe 16 cents in Canada. And I tell everybody when I tell them my cab driver what I do, I tell them it's a bargain at twice the price, and I believe it is. We also have an independent board of trustees, again, a very professional organization, and we have a professional management staff too. So although we're a nonprofit, we operate as a real independent company, and have, as do the regional entities that I mentioned. But it's a pretty unique model, and I think we're the only one that I know of where the regulator plays a strong intermediary role between the ultimate regulator, which in the U.S. is FERC, and industry, because we collaborate with industry very significantly in the development of our standards and in the execution of our programs. So here actually are what our programs are. So again, we focus on reliability and security of the bulk power system. We have 6 or 7 core program areas. The first is determining the reliability standards that will be in place. We think of those in 2 different categories: the operating and planning standards, the very kind of conventional way you design and operate the system, and then critical infrastructure protection, both cyber as well as physical security. We do what we call compliance assurance. A lot of that is executed through the regional entities. They conduct audits, spot checks, certifications of all the utilities that they're in compliance with the standards that are set. We enforce, as I said, in the United States. We levy penalties for non-compliances. We try to make sure that the penalties are just and reasonable, equitable across entities, and really focus on those things which are critical to reliability and not just distracted by administrative requirements. We also conduct reliability assessments and performance and event analysis. So a reliability assessment, we publish a summer and winter resource adequacy outlook for the upcoming season. We do a 10-year resource adequacy outlook annually. And occasionally we'll conduct a special assessment on issues that are critical to reliability, such as the growing dependence and interdependency with the natural gas system, the decline in large central station generation, largely to inform policymakers and other stakeholders of some of the reliability consequences of decisions that are being made, largely in the policy world. Performance and event analysis. When an event occurs on the system, we have the ability to work with industry to tear the event apart, really understand what happened, and most importantly, create a series of lessons learned to get out to industry to prevent similar events from happening in the future. We conduct situational awareness on our behalf and behalf of the Department of Energy and of FERC, just so we always know what is going on the system. We're not real-time operators. We don't have our hands on any controls, but we do monitor the health of the system on a near real-time basis. And then something I'll talk a little bit more about later is we also operate on behalf of industry what we call the Electricity Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or the EISAC, which is really the center of the industry's, or one of the kind of key centers of the industry's security posture. And I'll talk a little bit more about what we do there, but it's focused on physical and cybersecurity support to the industry. In the work that we do, we have to always strike a balance, and that's one of the things that makes NERC an interesting place to be, and again, a very interesting organization. So I think on one hand, we can only do our job if we can collaborate very effectively and on a trust basis with industry. This is an incredibly complicated machine, and understanding context for the work that we do is very, very important. So we have many ways that we engage with industry. Whenever we consider a major policy change, we get industry input on that. We have a very robust stakeholder engagement process, which extends to industry, but also the trade associations, the states, and other important bodies in making the reliability fabric of the industry work. We have a standing membership advisory committee that meets with our board on every quarter. And we have a series of technical committees where we get the best expertise we can out of industry to help us work on incredibly hard and problems that we've never seen before. So on the one hand, we have this highly collaborative model, but the only way that we preserve our value as the electric reliability organization is that we balance that with independence. So we have a classic yin-yang problem. But independence is very, very important because that's what gives our voice power, allows us to call balls and strikes the way we see them. The ways we assure independence, as I said, our funding is assured. We're not a dues-based organization, so nobody can say, if you don't do this my way, I'm not going to support you next year. We're ultimately funded by every customer in North America. We have an independent governance body in our board. Many of them have independent or industry experience and related experience to the industry, but none of them have any financial ties to any of the outcomes that we generate. Our assessments are, we strive for objectivity and technical purity in all of them. That gets more and more complicated as we work on issues that are highly politically charged, such as retirement of large generating plants and replacement with renewables. But we try to guard our technical chops very, very carefully and try to stay out of the policy fray. Right? We try to inform policy, we don't try to influence policy. And as I said, we're apolitical, right? So none of us are political appointees. We interact a lot, obviously, with the political establishment, but as an organization, we're above that in terms of our day-to-day work. So that's a little bit about how we work. In terms of identifying risks to reliability, I mentioned we do these reliability assessments. They're largely focused on resource adequacy, but increasingly we're bringing in other elements of reliability, such as frequency response, provision of what we call essential reliability services. Do we have enough flexibility in the system to deal with variable generation at the scale at which it's being deployed? As I said, we publish a long-term reliability assessment every year. It's a 10-year outlook at resource adequacy and issues that we see coming down the road. I think we all know that building energy infrastructure is a time-consuming, political, and very contentious process. So I think it's very important that we have our eyes at least 10 years down the road, because many of the solutions to the issues that are being created as we add more different types of generation to the system, will have their roots in other forms of infrastructure, whether it's natural gas infrastructure for fuel supply, deployment of synchronous condensers to maintain frequency response, what have you. Those don't prop up overnight. So it's really important that we in the industry keep our eyes quite a bit down the road. And coming out of those assessments, we publish guidelines for the industry. For example, one of the issues that we're increasingly concerned about is the growing reliance on natural gas. as a core fuel for the industry. Gas is a spectacular fuel, but it's a just-in-time. It's delivered just in time. And many parts of the country don't have adequate gas storage in the market area. And so being very mindful about how fuel contracts are struck and performance of the gas supply becomes a much more and increasingly critical part of providing electric reliability. Ensuring that we have enough flexibility in the system. If any of you have read any of the materials published by the California ISO on what we call affectionately the duck curve, which is basically created by a tremendous amount of solar being put on the system. The issue with solar is that it doesn't peak at the same, the generation doesn't peak at the same time that load peaks. So late in the afternoon, when loads are very high, the solar resource starts to fall off and the natural gas plants have to fire up to balance load. Well, that ramping behavior is very different than what any of these plants were ever designed to do. And it's also put amazing stresses on the natural gas system. It's increasingly difficult for the gas system to maintain pressure because these resources are sucking gas out faster than the pipelines can pack it in. So keeping an eye on system flexibility is a new and emerging key part of having a reliable system. We're looking and starting to get our heads around distributed resources, which we don't have any jurisdiction over. That's reserved to the states and the provinces. But increasingly, that going to have a material impact on how the bulk power system operates. So having good visibility into what's going on in the distribution system and understanding the dynamics of distribution-related resources on bulk power system resources is an area that we're starting to pay a lot of attention to. We just published annually a state of reliability report. It's available on our website. It's an annual assessment. And the 2019 series of conclusions, the biggest contributor to reliability issues continues to be weather. And increasingly severe weather leads to increasingly severe events related to weather. The industry is making a very good amount of progress on reducing protection system misoperations, which has been identified as a key issue for us. Frequency response is improving across the industry. As we add more and more solar onto the system, we're seeing lots of innovation in the market operators, particularly in California, on how to operate in a highly uncertain environment around load and resource. Although the cyber and physical threat continues to increase and increases every day, we still have not seen any loss of load that we can attribute to a physical or a security event. And a series of recommendations coming out of that, primarily around, we really need to get our modeling tools better situated for the type of system that we have. We really need to start focusing more on measuring and managing the resilience of the system, because resilience is which is the ability to recover from an event, is an increasingly important part of reliability. And then obviously kind of continuing to up our performance in the secure cyber and physical security arena. Let me talk a little bit about the infrastructure we have in place in North America for security, because it's probably occupies 80% of my time. First of all, we have a series of standards in place, and one of the things that's great about the electric industry is we're the only sector of any of the critical sectors I think in the world, but certainly in North America, that has mandatory and enforceable standards. Now, these standards aren't in and of themselves sufficient for a secure system, but they do provide a common level of protection and a baseline and a foundation for security. The way I think about the standards is that they're really in place to make sure that the neighborhood is safe. As I tell entities, standards aren't about you and your performance, it's about your neighbors and making sure that they have the same practices in place that you do. So they're an important aspect of security. The second thing is this entity I mentioned before, the EISAC, or the Information Sharing and Analysis Center. perimeter. This is a very interesting part of NERC. We hold it out very separate from the rest of our organization because it, unlike the rest of our activities, really is a member service function. Although it is funded through the same mechanism that the rest of our programs are funded by. It really exists only to serve the needs of the members. There's no statutory authority around the ISAC. But it has 4 or 5 major things that it does on behalf of industry. One, it provides a forum and a place for information sharing around security events. And we have a series of programs. Some of them are automated in terms of monitoring traffic on companies' enterprise systems and understanding if there's traffic that shouldn't be there, so entities can take appropriate action. We have a series of voluntary sharing mechanisms where chief security officers around the industry can share their incident reports very rapidly to a trusted community without government or regulatory oversight to alert their neighbors and their colleagues of issues that they're facing. And also threat intelligence from the intelligence agencies, whether that's the Department of Energy, Homeland Security. We're in the process of building a relationship with Natural Resources Canada and the security establishment in Canada as well. And it becomes a way for government to disseminate intelligence out to industry. We also conduct threat analytics, both on classified as well as open source intelligence gathering that we have. We spend a lot of time working with industry, making sure they understand the capabilities that we're building within the ISAC, but most importantly that we get to understand what they need out of the ISAC so that we can work with them to deliver it. We have a group we call the Members Executive Committee, which is a subset of this other entity I'll talk about in a minute, the Coordinating Council, that serves as a steering committee for the ISAC and helped us put in place a 5-year resource and capability building plan that we're now in the middle of year 2 on. We also conduct a lot of training and create forums for exchange of ideas and capabilities for the industry, and we drill. Every 2 years we conduct a massive continent-wide simulated cyber and physical coordinated attack on North America. It's called GridX. If you're in North America, I would welcome you to participate in it. If you're not in North America, I'd welcome you to observe it. We really try very, very hard to completely break the system through a series of coordinated attacks. Mainly because that allows the entities that participate to be able to test their own response capabilities and their restoration capabilities. It's a major effort. As I said, the GridX 5 will be happening in November of this year. We've also spent a lot of time developing cross-sector and cross-border relationships. People ask me how I feel about the electric sector security, and my answer always is, if I could draw a box around the electric sector, I'd feel really good about it, because we have lots of very good protections in place and a highly engaged leadership of the industry in this area, but I can't draw a box around it. So it's important that we understand what's going on in places like the natural gas system. So we have a relationship with the natural gas ISAC. They actually sit on our floor 3 days a week, so there's very clear and timely information sharing between them. We just announced yesterday an arrangement with the oil and natural gas ISAC, which deals with the upstream petroleum and refining sector. We have a relationship with the water ISAC. Water is critical to the production of power, and the production of power is critical to the ability to run a municipal water system. The multi-state ISAC, which assists all of the public power entities in North America, and financial services, which is probably the most advanced in their thinking on the cyber risk because they've been such a target for such a long period of time. And then over the last couple years, we've put a real emphasis on cross-border information sharing, particularly with our members and colleagues in Canada. We just announced a pilot initiative with the independent system operator in Ontario that is building a very, very interesting capability. It's similar to what we are building in the ISAC, but in some areas has tools that go well beyond what we've developed in terms of having insight into operating technology and what's going out on the operating systems of their member utilities. So we've entered into an information sharing and resource sharing agreement with the IESO that we're very excited about, both because it'll help our ability to penetrate the Canadian security establishment, give the U.S. entities access to that intelligence and that information stream, and again allows us to get information back into Canada as well. So we think it's a great win-win for all the entities. Right now it's focused on Ontario, but I think Canada has aspirations for growing that on a broader provincial footprint as the model proves out. We also have MOUs with the European Energy ISAC, as well as we just entered into one with the Japanese Energy ISAC as well. So with our colleagues in the free world to share information about threats as we see them. We also have something we call the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, the ESCC, which is a group of about 30 CEOs from around the industry, including Canadian participation, that meets 3 times a year to identify issues and then work with our government partners in both Canada and the U.S. to affect change, to improve the industry's ability to understand and respond to incidents. It's also the entity that gets together whenever there's a hurricane or a major storm or an earthquake to help coordinate restoration, both among industry participants as well as with the government. For example, to get high water boat trucks available in a hurricane area, to waive no-fly rules so that drones can be used to survey damage, those kinds of things. So it's a very effective forum for getting the best of government and the best of industry together to help each other. And then, as I said, we're highly dependent on our government partners. I mentioned here the Department of Energy and the Department of Homeland Security. I'm hoping in a year or two I'll have Natural Resources Canada and the counterpart organizations in Canada and Mexico with fairly seamless interactions for us as well. So that's sort of the security establishment we have in North America. With that, I'll conclude. Again, I think hopefully this kind of gives you a sense of what we do and why we think that the services we provide, while we don't have our hands on any controls and we don't own and operate any assets, but we think we make a material contribution to strengthening the reliability fabric in North America. There are clearly challenges, and as the grid changes and the changes that we're seeing as we move towards a decarbonized, digitized, and distributed resource base present lots of challenges for us, but the foundation is in place for us to engage with industry to address those. And as I think about the risk priorities that we have, they really kind of fall into 3 major buckets. The first, obviously, is security. Some of the things that we're spending a lot of time on right now is supply chain, and really understanding the issues in the supply chain and the best ways for entities to mitigate those risks as they present themselves. Cloud computing, our standards narrowly defined really call for security of devices. And one of the things that we're working with industry on and FERC is to change that orientation towards the security of the data and security of the information, which would enable utilities to take advantage of cloud services, which is, I think, an important capability and has the potential to significantly improve security if we do it smartly. And then electromagnetic pulse is a topic of great interest right now. The Electric Power Research Institute recently published a report with the science around how an EMP event would affect various kinds of transformers, and we're now working with them and a stakeholder group to determine what the right ERO response to that work is. Changes in the RC, the Reliability Coordinator function in the West. In 2 months, the existing RC, it's a company called Peak Reliability, will go out of business. And its function will be picked up by BC Hydro here in British Columbia. the California ISO for the majority of the interconnection, and then the Southwest Power Pool will be providing RC services to the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. It's a really important transition and a really critical one, because one of the things that's challenging about the Western interconnection is that it really does operate as a single machine. A problem with BPA, Bonneville Power Administration system in the Pacific Northwest can rapidly manifest itself as a problem in New Mexico if it's not managed correctly. So the transition from a single reliability coordinator to multiple ones creates a whole bunch of coordination and seams issues that we're concerned about and working with industry to address. And then lastly is just the transformation in the industry. And my position on this has always been that we can make any system work with enough time, money, and talented engineers. But we need time to be able to address some of the challenges. And one of the things that has been concerning is that the pace at which industry transformation is occurring, particularly the retirement of coal and nuclear plants, has the potential to create some real challenges for the industry if our eyes really aren't on the ball of how we're going to manage through that. So the change in the resource mix is clear in terms of the policy objectives that the states want to have in place around resources, and now it's all about managing change and ensuring that the reconfigured system can manage and operate itself reliably. So with that, I'll thank you for your attention, and I'll now fend off questions.
Well, thank you. Please join me thanking Jim. Thank him now, but I'm still going to ask you a few questions, even though we run out of time. But you can stay up there.
No, I was just going to grab my coffee.
Yeah, you be the only one who get to stand and answer questions. So that's your.
Okay, very good.
So I just want to jump on the last thing you mentioned regarding the pace of change, right? And what's interesting is I'd like to hear your thoughts on, as the industry changes and the system gets to change, yet and still the planning process, the standards seem to be based on yesterday's thinking, right? And I see Professor Saifu Ramaya from IEEE, with more inverter-based systems coming online, the need for inertia might go away. Perhaps in the future, we're not even using frequency to measure the system, right? Because you just have all these sort of low inertia systems. What is NERC doing proactively to look at standards and how, instead of, like you said, the pace of change is so fast, but is there research being done to anticipate a world where you have more sort of low inertia systems online, or where you have HVDC back-to-back links that interconnect Canada and the U.S., where you have no AC ties, just DC ties? How are you working proactively to change the standards?
So we have two comments on that one. First of all, we have an ongoing process we call the Standards Efficiency Review that we initiated a couple years ago. That's going through all of the standards and trying to contemporize them. Do two things: contemporize them to the risks that we see now. And the original suite of standards, I think everybody who looked at them would say we were over-standardized. A lot of administrative requirements that don't necessarily drive reliability events. So we're trying to get all the standards cleaned up. We just filed with FERC earlier this year to retire about 20% of the requirements that are under the O&P standards. That's a good first step. There's still way too many requirements. I think we know that. It's just a matter of trying to figure out the process for moving them through. We do not move quickly, as you might expect, right? Our model is based on industry engagement and consensus. So to get a standard changed is a multi-year, 2-year process. The good news, though, is that once we get through that process, everyone's pretty much agreed to them, so there's no litigation and so forth afterwards. The other issue that you mentioned, though, which is really important, is if you think about the change in the composition of the resource base, and particularly the move toward low inertia systems, inverter-based systems. One of the things I am most proud of in terms of the work that NERC has done over the last several years was in response to a wildfire in California, in Southern California, called the Blue Cut Fire, which resulted in about 1,000 megawatts of solar tripping off the system. And the good news about this is we now had the case to really study that event. The bad news about it is the electric industry is great at reacting. It is not great at getting in front of issues, right, until the event occurs. But following that event, the California ISO, Southern California Edison, LADWP, NERC, WEC, the regional entity in the West, solar developers, inverter manufacturers, an entity called the North American Generator Forum, all got together and very rapidly diagnosed what the issues were, and within about 6 months got a guideline out to the industry on how to handle it. The great thing about these inverter-based resources is many of them are smart. Many of them can do almost anything you want them to do, but you have to tell them what to do. And no one had ever done that work before. So we have a lot of effort underway, highly focused right now, again, around inverter-based resources. We're also looking at natural gas and some of the innovations we're seeing in places like New England, which has severe gas constraints, to be able to manage through those kinds of issues. So we have efforts underway, whether we're working out 50 years to a completely reconfigured system, not yet, right? But we're trying to figure out how to manage the transition right now.
Okay, I'll try to squeeze in a few more questions here. I know we're running out of time, but there's a lot of questions that have come in. I don't want to just skip by them. So I'll try to combine them into one. So you use a phrase which I will steal from you going forward. You said IoT stands for the Internet of Threats as opposed to Internet of Things, which is great. Now, you mentioned cloud computing. You talked about security of data, security of devices. What's the difference in the context of these two themes, security of data and security of devices?
So let me see if I can do this in a layperson's term, because that's what I am in this area. The standards, as they call right now, call for any device, a server or what have you, that houses what we call bulk power system critical infrastructure information, BCSI, to be secured. Access control has to be in a separate room. Fairly expensive and cumbersome to maintain. The concept around cloud computing is, how do you use encryption? How do you make sure that the cloud service provider that you work with has the same level of protection so that you know that your data is secure, as opposed to the device itself? And my view is that for many entities, particularly many smaller entities, a company like Amazon or Microsoft in their cloud computing businesses will be much more secure than what a small public power will be able to afford to put in place. And so we just need to be very clear about what the data protection requirements are, and then that would enable industry to take advantage of that capability.
I'll take one question from the audience for Ted.
Okay. Over the last 5 or 6 years, as you know, there's been quite a bit of work done on the cybersecurity side. And it's been, as I've observed it, kind of a series of stages of maturing in kind of our cyber readiness. What do you see over the next, say, 2 to 3 years as that kind of next big step that the industry needs to take to further mature its cyber readiness?
It's a great question, Ted. I think the biggest opportunity area for us in the security area is getting better insight and understanding of activity on the operating technology side of the business. We have lots of programs, lots of awareness around enterprise systems, which are not unimportant by any stretch of the imagination. But our ability to penetrate in an automated way activity on the operating technology is pretty remedial, I would say. And in our conversations with the Department of Energy, they have an initiative underway they call CAT 2.0, Cyber Analytic Tools and Techniques. And moving forward on an operating technology monitoring system is very high on their agenda, and I think that's pretty smart.
A quick follow-up on that. Are any of the national labs working on that with industry?
Yes. Mostly, I think, Pacific Northwest National Lab and also the one in Idaho are heavily involved.
Well, in the interest of time, Jim is going to be here, I guess. So if you have any questions afterwards, please feel free to reach out to him. So please join me in thanking him once again.
Thank you very much.